As they debate their cunning plans for Cameron and Carrie, Mr. and Mrs. Newman's sick imaginations are explored in chapter 1351. They discuss how to influence Callum and the York family to further their own agenda while revealing their true motivations and expressing their contempt for Cameron inside the confines of their soundproofed room. Despite acknowledging his love for Cameron as his brother's only child, Mr. Newman places more emphasis on his love for his own children. In light of their ongoing feud with the Yorks and the likelihood that the York bachelors would not favor Carrie as a potential marriage, he is adamantly opposed to Cameron getting married into the York family. He advises placing Carrie's independence first and comes up with a strategy to keep Callum at a distance after she is free. The Marshalls, a side branch of the family, are being considered by Mrs. Newman as a potential source of retaliation against the depraved bodyguard. She thinks Callum might not be aware of the man's connection, and she expects the Marshalls to punish him properly. They consent to place the blame on the bodyguard in order to save their own reputations and make sure he leaves Wiltspoon. Mrs. Newman expresses worry over Cameron's relationship with Callum and the prospect of her developing a sexual relationship with him. These concerns are allayed by Mr. Newman, who emphasizes the unlikely chance of Callum marrying Cameron and points out her blindness. He reminds Mrs. Newman that Cameron is her own daughter and that criticizing her would make her seem bad. He begs her to stop calling Cameron insults. The discussion takes a nasty turn when Mrs. Newman admits to having a long-standing grudge against Cameron. She recalls instances in the past where she considered killing Cameron, explaining her annoyance to seeing Cameron as a representation of her deceased ex-husband. She is warned by Mr. Newman for having such ideas, as he explains that Cameron is his brother's child and poses no danger to them. In order to put a stop to the upheaval, he assures her that once Carrie is free, they can marry her off to someone else. They start talking about what happened 10 years ago, when Mrs. Newman learned Cameron had doubts about her deceased ex-husband's death. Mrs. Newman admits to treating Cameron cruelly and feels that by blinding her and causing damage to her eyes, she has neutralized any threat. They talk about that cane that was left in their room, and Mrs. Newman cynically throws it outside to show how she doesn't care about Cameron's impairment. Serenity awakens with a headache at the end of the chapter, oblivious to the sinister plans and dialogues that were discussed. Her contented ignorance stands in stark contrast to the cunning scheme being carried out behind closed doors. The actual nature of Mr. and Mrs. Newman is exposed in this chapter, demonstrating their disdain for Cameron and their Machiavellian attempts to influence the situation in their favor. Their callous behavior and contempt for Cameron's welfare reveal their sick objectives, setting the tone for the approaching conflict between the Newmans and the York family is Serenity's continued ignorance of the threat.